We're live.
Thank you. Welcome to Senate Education on Wednesday, March 30th, 2:54. We're going to go until roughly 4:30 today, and we're going to start our work by returning to Chapter 11 rewrite, page 727, until Ms. St. James needs to go to, I believe, House Education at 3:30. Depending on time, we'll also take a look at the language for SQ 48. We'll return to that language and have a discussion about it. And then we will go into H716, an act related to making miscellaneous changes in education law, specifically the special ed postponement date. So that is really an overview of what we're going to be working on. Again, if time permits, we'll also jump into the educational surplus conversation again. But for now, not seeing any questions. Ms. St. James, thanks for returning to Senate Ed to take us through more of 727.
Sure. Beth St. James, Office of Village Council. I believe, so we're still on chunk one.
Chunk one.
I have earmarked that we left off on page 46.
Okay.
Which is the operational meeting. We're in the middle of the operational meeting of the district itself. And we kind of stopped at the highlighting in the middle of page 46, which was a policy, a change from current law, a policy consideration that House Ed made. So you all have the policy consideration document that AOE drafted. It will not have all of this chicken scratch on it, obviously. Did you send this to them, Daphne? It's from AOE, from Donna.
Okay, let me resend it. Yeah, I did send it yesterday.
Okay.
Is it posted on our page?
No, I'll post it.
All right, let's take a look. If everybody, would you reframe the question, Ms. St. James, that we left on? Or review that question?
The one where there was the confusion, we got the email from Donna. Sure. Yeah. So the section that we're looking at starts on page 44, line 16. So it's section 715, the organizational meeting notice business to be transacted. Mm-hmm. And this section addresses the organizational meeting of the district itself, not the board. So remember, the district is a body politic. It's a municipality. Mm-hmm. So it has some business to transact. This section addresses how do they do that organizational meeting to get everything going.
That's right.
And I believe the confusion was around page 45, lines 17 through 19. In comparing that to, as you continue to go on, specifically page 46, there's also, there's discussion about electing a temporary clerk and a temporary presiding officer. And then there's a discussion about electing the clerk. And so Donna was helpful in clarifying, because I was not clear enough, that this is the organizational meeting of the district itself. Mm-hmm. So on page 45, I'm looking at lines 17 through 19, and it's talking about electing a temporary presiding officer and a temporary clerk of the union district. Mm-hmm. From among the voters present at the organizational meeting. We're talking about electing a temporary presiding officer and a temporary clerk for this organizational meeting. You're not going to elect someone who's not there to help you. Mm-hmm. So you're electing them from you're electing them from the voters present at the organizational meeting to help that organizational meeting get started. And part of the business, once they've done that, over on page 46, mm-hmm. They've adopted other rules of order. Robert's rules is called out there. They've elected a moderator of the union, and now they're going to elect the clerk of the union school district going forward.
This sounds similar to after town meeting day elections when select boards have to reorganize. Yeah. Because you don't have a chair or a clerk at that time. Mm-hmm. So,
but I think the question yesterday was around who are the registered voters, and so it would be anyone who's at that meeting who is eligible to vote in that district. Right?
Yes. So the registered voters. So it's the registered voters who are registered voters in that district.
And are present at that meeting.
Correct. This specific section just applies to the organizational meeting. When we move further into this draft, there's an entire section, there's an entire subchapter for business as usual. You've already had your organizational meeting, you're up and running, and there is a provision in there for a checklist of voters. So issues of who is a voter for the Unified Union School District or the Union Elementary or the Union High School District is addressed. How is that determined? How is that checked for if there's floor voting, et cetera? That is addressed later on in this draft, but for the purposes of the organizational meeting, we're just talking about the voters of the district.
Okay.
Moving on.
So I'm still not seeing anything from Daphne. Do you have something that you were going to post?
I just posted something. I also just forwarded it.
Okay, you forwarded it to all of us. So that's basically a kind of a, what you just said, Ms. St. James, is basically what's in the memo that we're opening up right now from, no, it's not.
No.
Okay.
So that was the confusing question last night that I think there was a slight bit of clarity on when we left. But we stopped at the highlighting, which is the election of the clerk of the Union School District on page 46. And that is the policy consideration
Okay.
that this document flagged and provided guidance on, and so puts in context what you're looking at.
Okay.
Do you want to move on from that? Okay.
I think we do, unless Senator Hooker, did you have a
No,
follow?
I'm all
Okay,
set. Thank
please
you.
go ahead.
So if, again, remember, this is the business of the organizational meeting. What are they
That's
doing here? So one of the things they have to do is elect a clerk of the Union School District, again, from the voters, and elect a treasurer. So one of the policy considerations that was made, a pitch for a policy consideration that was made by AOE was current law is the voters vote for these folks, for these positions. There was a pitch made and House Education elected to adopt that pitch, and that is to also allow a vote to authorize the school board to appoint the clerk and the treasurer, rather than having that be something that the voters have to vote on. I think the policy consideration behind that was that it tends to be non-controversial and not very exciting. And so an option would be to allow the school board to appoint those positions, and that is what this draft has done. In current law, there is no option for an appointment. The other policy decision,
I'm sorry, can we help you?
Cindy, come in.
Oh, I'm afraid we're at 10. We're at 10 people right now. Thank you, though. Oh, no, wait, we have somebody not here. Come on in.
We're not taking up that issue right now.
Yeah, we're not taking up that issue that I think you're here for right now. You're welcome. to come back. We are. Thanks. Sorry, Ms. St. James, we have Senator Purcell's constituents who periodically need to pop in and see what we're up to.
They don't trust
Is
me.
there anything else that we expect you would have to?
You.
Ms. St. James, apologies from all of us in Washington County.
page 46, lines, one word on line 10 to line 12. The other policy consideration made here was that the treasurer does not need to be a resident of the Union School District. That is not spelled out in current law, and that was a policy consideration made. So continuing on, this is all of the business that the organizational meeting needs to determine, all the way over to page 47, line 16. Do you want to go through any of the other business?
I'm looking at the committee,
Specifically.
I'm not seeing anybody at this point. Okay. Right to 48 and the policy issue.
Sure, we can skip all the way over there. This is, so on page 48, there was a policy consideration made on line 9 that the voters could, if there's a default one-year term, there was a policy consideration made and adopted to allow the voters to extend the length of the district officers up to 3 years. And that's the, that takes us through the organizational meaning of the district itself. And now we're looking at how do we transition to full operation of the school district, the union school district. So we're on page 48, line 14, article 2, transition, dissolution, reorganization, and discontinuation of forming districts, sale of real property, supervisory unions and supervisory districts. So the first provision in the transition to full operations, so I will point out that section 716, in current law, there is mention of a transitional period, but it's not spelled out as clearly and detailed as this draft provides. So a lot of transition to full operations is primarily new and based on guidance that AOE has developed and helping all of the recent mergers that have popped up. So operational date, there needs to be an operational date. There's a default of July 1, unless the voter approved articles of agreement establish a different date. And then on top of page 49, subsection B, roles and authority during the transitional period. This is important because the transitional period is just that, it's a transitional period, but there are still kiddos that need to go to school. So who provides that education? So the forming districts, so all of the districts that voted to form this new union school district, they continue to be responsible for the education of their respective resident students until that operational date. So the kiddos during this transition period, they're just getting ready. They're building momentum. They're making sure that they've got all their contracts worked out, all of their lessons, the curriculum worked out, etc. But the kids are still going to school and the districts still exist to provide that education during that transitional period. The board of the new union school district, on the other hand, also has to do some work. And that's what subdivision 2 on page 49, it outlines all of the things that the new union school district needs to develop: policies, curriculum, educational programs, assessment measures, etc. Then there's a provision for during the transitional period and continuing until the voters approve a budget. What do they do if they need money? So page 49, line 14, the board of the new union school district shall have the authority to borrow sufficient funds to meet pending obligations. The board votes whether to include the total sum borrowed under the subsection as education spending in the board's proposed budget for the initial fiscal year, or is to treat the sum as a deficit. And that is current law.
Right.
Thank you. Page 50, assets. What about all those assets that all those individual school districts had? Now we're one body politic. There's a definition of asset, and that includes all real and personal property, operating fund accounts, special fund accounts, trust fund accounts, accounts receivable, and any other property.
So you don't need to read every bit. I think generally, if you could talk about this section,
Yep.
Is it largely definitions?
Nope, there's just that one definition,
Okay.
and then it goes into there needs to be a provision of the transfer of property and the acquisition of title there.
Okay. So if a school is closing and the assets in that school, it's that sort of situation that we're dealing with here?
Yeah, so I think what this is mainly trying to get at is making sure if school district A held the title to a piece of property or an asset, now school district A doesn't exist anymore. Transfer of that asset needs to happen. And so this talks about doing that, making sure that's all done before the operational date. Let's see, unless, of course, most everything in here is by a certain date, unless the voter approved articles of agreement call for another specific date. There's a prohibition on page 50 of not transferring ownership of an asset to any entity other than the union school district between the date on which the vote occurred and the date of the operational date. apparently this was a new issue. This is not in current law. This is a new issue that arose during recent activity to form union school districts. I don't have any details on that, but I'm sure Donna could provide real world examples, but that's not in current law, that's new.
Okay.
Moving on to page 51, trust funds. Again, the union school district should hold and apply all trust funds transferred to it as the terms of the trust indicate. Reserve funds, the union school district shall hold and apply all reserve funds. So that's all assets, that's all the stuff that we're bringing in, but there's also liabilities that the school districts most likely had. So again, there's a definition, we're on page 51, a definition for what is a liability, and then very similar to assets, those liabilities need to be transferred and assumed. There's a prohibition, so on page 51, again, this is a new issue that arose during recent activity to form union school districts. Lines 20, prohibition. The union district shall not assume liabilities that a forming district incurs between the date on which the vote occurs to approve and the operational date. So if the vote occurs and there's a new liability that occurs 3 months later, the union district doesn't have to take on that liability. However, a union school district shall in all cases assume the contractual obligations of the member districts regarding each collective bargaining agreement or other employment contract entered into during the transitional period.
Well, okay, so there isn't any way they can post date or a liability. It says exists on June 30th, that would include an agreement of some type to take on a liability after June 30th, I would think. Okay, can I answer my own question?
And I will note that when it comes to withdrawal, I believe that there is some discussion outside of this building about what to do with those collectively bargained agreements in the opposite direction. So we're merging here, saying we got to take them on. What happens if someone's leaving? There is nothing contemplated in any of the chunks that you're going to look at. But I think I think Donna mentioned that in her testimony in the first stage of the SILAC, that there might be some language coming to you about that.
If there were a lawsuit during this process, how would that work itself out or not?
Depends on who the parties are.
Okay.
So and depends on when that lawsuit was filed.
Between the both of them?
So a liability, so the district shall assume all liability of the forming districts that exist on the June 30th immediately preceding the operational date. So if that liability existed before the operational date, before the operational date, let's see, has to transfer all of the liabilities, but a union school district shall not assume liabilities that were incurred between the date the vote happened to form the district and the operational date.
Okay.
So if we're in that transitional period and it's a new liability and the forming school district, so the district that voted to join the union school or create the union school district, if that suit is against that forming district, I think there's a lot of variables that could come into play, but I think the plain language of this is that if that liability incurs in that transitional period, the union school district does not take it on unless explicitly authorized by the voter approved articles of agreement or approved by the board.
So if there's a liability previous to the vote.
Yep.
That hasn't been resolved.
Yep.
Then the new district takes on that liability, but if there's a new suit in between the vote and the institution of the new district, that's not
Correct.
responsibility of the new district.
Unless the articles of agreement say it is, or the board votes to take it on.
Okay.
And I think realistically what's happening is if there is a liability that's occurring prior to the vote, most likely the study committee, the secretary of the AOE and the State Board of Education either knew it was coming and contemplated it, or it was in existence and it was part of the study committee process and just making a decision on whether or not it was worth everyone's time. And then most likely addressed in the articles of agreement or anything like that. So, does that make sense? We're on page 52. The last subsection in this section is at the district's first annual meeting following assumption of full operations or at a later meeting. The voters of any union school district shall vote a sum sufficient to pay any unpaid balance of expenses that was incurred by or on behalf of the union school district during the transitional period. So just giving them the opportunity to clean that up. Page 52, line 16. So there were all of these individual school districts that voted to merge. We know that the new school district is the new school district, but what happens to those old school districts? So if we're looking at a unified union school district, on its operational date, the unified union school district supplants all forming districts and all forming districts cease to exist. Again, except if the voter approved articles of agreement explicitly provide for the forming districts to exist for up to 6 months to wrap up any business that's left over. And that's current law.
That's number.
But in this section, how is this form or relate to chunk 2 that we're going to talk about later?
So chunk 2 is a union school district is up and running and has been up and running for, according to the H727 in current law, at least a year. And someone wants to leave it.
So this is the dissolution of those that formed,
Correct.
not dissolution of what
No.
they want to get out.
Nope. Remember, we're still under the umbrella of forming. We're still under the organizational umbrella. So, the only way I have been able to survive this bill is to think of it as forming and getting up and running. And then right after that is withdrawal.
Yeah.
So it splits it up. And then everything after withdrawal is you're up and running. How do you just maintain day to day? So it's formation, break of withdrawal, and then normal business. So that's for a unified union school district. Relatively simple concept because in a unified union school district, there are no member districts. All of the districts, they're sending all of their kids to this unified union school district for all grades, pre-K through 12. For a union elementary or a union high school district, there's some reorganization going on because a union elementary or a union high school is only organized to provide for those grades. So it is likely, not in every situation, but it's likely that if you are a member of a union elementary or a union high school district, your town is also a member of another school district that provides the education in the other grades. So there's still, so in a unified union school district, when everyone's merging, they're done, they're kaput. There's no more reason for those school districts to exist. But for a union elementary or a union, if it's a new union elementary or union high school district, there are still other grades that those towns need to provide education for their children. So there's likely still a school district hanging around. What happens to that? But send that to the page. Okay. So on its operational date, we're on page 53. So this is not explicitly anywhere in current law, but it is just kind of a natural explanation of what happens. So again, this is an area where it's not in current law, but it's a concept that exists just kind of by virtue of how this whole process happens, and was added for clarity and detail. So on its operational date, we're on line 6, a Union Elementary or Union High School district shall supplant each forming district only for the grades for which the new Union Elementary or Union High School district is organized. Each forming district shall cease to be organized to provide for the education in the supplanted grades, but shall continue to be responsible for other grades for which it is organized. Again, there's that carve out that if the voter approved articles of agreement say you can hang around to finish up unfinished business, you can do that for 6 months. Now, what happens if there is someone who joined or merged to form a Union Elementary and a Union High School district, but they are not responsible for any education for their kiddos because they're also a member of a different school district for that chunk of grades. So if the forming district is organized to provide for education solely in the grades for which the Union Elementary or Union High School is organized, so it was a Union Elementary School and it merged with other Union Elementary schools or other school districts to form a new Union Elementary School, there's no one left to provide education for. So what happens to it? The forming district ceases all educational operations on the new Union District date, and the forming district ceases to exist, page 54. This language, cease to exist, was a policy consideration. So let's see. You have that document that there's a nice explanation of what's happening here.
Which document?
The policy consideration document, something I did not prepare.
Oh, okay. The one that
This is the
Daphne
one
that we
emailed just a little while ago.
Yeah.
Okay.
Is it
That's
also
on your
on the
email.
site?
It's on the site. It might be easier to put
Okay.
an email
Yeah.
because I think it's under Ms. St. James. I think everything, is it under Ms. St. James?
Yeah.
Yeah, and everything's under Ms. St. James. So it is in email, having arrived at 2:56.
So basically this policy decision was that the district that no longer needs to exist because there's no one left to provide education for is dissolved as a matter of law. On page 2, it's section 717, subdivision B2, town district that is a member of UHSD. That's where the explanation of the policy consideration occurs.
Since the forming district shall cease to exist.
Those are the originals.
The original,
original?
sure, original,
Okay.
original.
And so what was happening prior to this?
Prior to,
To this, or what's happening right now?
I don't believe that there's a specific,
I mean, they're sort of not existing, but we're just putting that in law that this is what.
yes, I believe this is an attempt to codify what's actually practically happening.
Okay, no, that's helpful. Thank you.
So
Yeah,
if I
please.
may, just to clarify, there are a group of elementary schools that
Mhm.
form a district.
Mhm.
There may or may not be a high school related to them or near them. The high school is not in the district. So the elementary schools become this new entity, but the high school is, okay, the high school doesn't have to join, so there doesn't have to be that unified union school district. Okay,
No,
and it's just considered a unified elementary school district.
correct. Yes, so it depends on the grade it is organized to provide education for. So if the school district is organized to provide pre-K through, I believe, I'd have to look it up off the top of my head. Someday I'll know all of this off the top of my head. Whatever the
Sorry.
Title 16 definition is of elementary education versus secondary education or high school education, if a school district is organized to provide for grades in either one of those categories, then it would be either a Union Elementary or a Union High School district. If it's organized to provide education for pre-K through 12,
It's a
that's the
unified.
unified.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Do you want to move on?
Please.
Okay, page 54, section 718, line 9, transfer of real property. So this is based, so this is not spelled out in current law, but I believe that this is concept. I don't want to say language because I have not looked at every article of agreement. But I believe that this concept of the transfer of real property in the town to which it is located is a concept that appears in articles of agreement everywhere. And so it was included in this draft is again, a comprehensive piece of what goes into the formation of a union school district. So if in the formation process, if the articles of agreement require sale of real property, so remember real property is tangible things, buildings, to the town in which the property is located, and the sale is scheduled to occur after the operational date, or if after the operational date and completing all of the prerequisites. Basically, this is saying the town may assume title to the real property for a price that is less, so there can be a sale back to the town for less than fair market value,
Okay.
only as follows. And there's 3 provisions here. And this is, again, not in current law, but is based on concepts that appear in most articles of agreement that are out there right now. So the conveyance to the town shall be made subject to all encumbrances of record, the assumption of payment of all outstanding bonds and notes, and the repayment of any school construction aid grants may be required of any by law. The conveyance of the town shall be conditioned upon the town owning and using the real property for community and public purposes for 5 years. And if the town sells real property prior to 5 years of ownership, then the town shall compensate the Union School District for all capital improvements prior to the sale to the town. So this is just if property is going to be transferred back to the town it's located in.
So, and by transfer, purchase really, or it doesn't have to be purchased, but so you could sell it back to the town for $1.
Yes,
And this would be, as you're saying, in circumstances where it might be used as community center, all those kinds. And again, these are old properties. These are properties that now schools.
they exist. They were
They exist. They
existing.
might not actually be physically old, but they're not going to be used as schools.
Right, so it's, and remember, this provision applies to if they're selling it for less than the fair market value.
Right.
So if there's a fair sale,
Mhm.
I don't believe it has to be used as community property.
Any questions on that?
And they can do that? The schools can enter it, or it's the town that's selling?
So it would be the Union School District who's now taken on this because it was a school building and it was an asset of the school district. The Union School District is now taking this on. It's the Union School District selling it back to the town.
Okay. So there's no, it has to, okay, it has, so, but there's no time frame within which any of this has to happen.
There is,
Except
5 years.
by the,
on page 54, lines, I guess it really starts on line 12. If the sale of property of the town in which the property is located and the sale is scheduled to occur after the operational date, or if after the operational date and after completing all of their prerequisites, the Union School District offers to sell any of its real property to the town in which the property is located. So this is all happening after the operational date.
yeah, but so it could be years after the operation,
I mean, it could just be sitting there.
couldn't it? I mean, it could just
Yeah.
be
Yeah.
whenever,
Yes.
right? So they have time to decide, do they really want to keep that or not?
But some of these, I suspect, some of these options or some of this criteria to get the price lower is sort of to, I mean, people don't want these buildings
Empty
just sitting, empty buildings sitting around.
I suspect Donna would have real world examples for
Okay.
you of where this may have occurred.
Yeah, yeah. Is that a good spot to pause, the building piece?
Let me see, if we can fit in one more thing really quickly.
Okay.
I think just the next section, page 55 to page 56, is just the state board shall assign each union school district to a supervisory union. If the unified union school district is large enough, then the state board may designate it its own supervisory district, and that's current law. And then there's a little policy change here. So remember, a supervisory union is not a municipality. It's for administrative purposes. If the supervisory union is a supervisory union, then it has its own board, and the board is made up of members of the boards of the school district, the supervisory union oversees. So if a supervisory union includes at least one district that is a unified union school district, so the supervisory union could include a unified union school district, an elementary school district, an individual town school district. It could be made up of a whole host of those. But if it includes a unified union school district, then the state board on its own initiative or at the request of the supervisory union or board or one or more districts of the supervisory union may at any time adjust supervisory union board representation to more fairly and accurately reflect the relative number of students for which each district is responsible and the grades for which each district operates school or schools. This is a concept, so this is not currently in chapter 11. It's actually somewhere else in Title 16, in section 261. And 261 allows the State Board of Education, who assigns school districts to a supervisory union, to make adjustments to the supervisory union board. So all this is doing is saying not only can the State Board of Education do this on its own initiative, but it can also do it, 260, so current law in a separate part of Title 16 and in section 261 says, if someone comes to the state board and says, we think the supervisory union board representation should be adjusted to be more fair, the State Board of Education can do that. All this does is also give the state board the ability to do that on its own initiative without someone asking it to do that. And again, that was a policy consideration that was adopted by House Education.
Who's recording this on the floor?
Do we have Let's Count
Yeah.
I actually think it'll be easier than.
And I have
It
an
seems.
annotated version that I'll
Yeah.
give whoever is recording it, so it's clear what's current law and what's not.
We'll keep it high level on the floor.
You get a lot of thanks.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you're right. So that's a great spot to pause. So we'll pick up again with you tomorrow on this. And we know you have to go to House Education now. Committee, any final questions from Ms. St. James before we move on to S248? And I'll just review S248 with everybody. Thank you for the edits.
If they are not what you were looking for, just let me know. and I
Sure,
can make
sure.
those, edits.
Yeah, so if senators on your desks, Daphne did put a copy of S248, I believe, on everyone's desk.
Yeah, but who's on the agenda?
It's a new one, right?
Yeah, yeah, it's the new edited version where we really put more, say, direct, forceful language, if you will, rather than giving options.
Okay.
The highlights, thank you, Ms. St. James, for that, as well as for what we're looking at now. Highlights are in yellow. Senators will see on page 2 that we are also in the considerations, adding the faculty and staff members who will be added to the Board of Trustees. We have Senator Lyons' language also on page 2 regarding the updating the bylaws. And in working on this report, we have asked that UVM and the Vermont State Colleges consult with their respective faculty governing boards. I'm inclined to say that we might even expand that to and other relevant parties or something like that. We're not voting on this right now. We probably have another week or so before we would even start to move something like this, but wanted to give committee members an opportunity to add whatever they would like now that I'm happy to bring back to Ledge Council or someone else may. I'm also wondering, Ms. Ramos, is this something that you would like to weigh in on at this point on behalf of this? No, okay. And you have a copy.
Is it the same on?
It's, Daphne, would you mind printing up a copy for Ms. Ramos? Thanks.
Can I ask a procedural question?
Please, yeah.
So this far outside of crossover, how, if we advance this to the Senate and assume the Senate passes it, what mechanism do we have to get it to the House?
It's a great question, really great question. So we would attach it likely to miscellaneous education, the House bill.
Okay, so that's similar to what we were talking about Holocaust.
Exactly.
And we have time to do that still.
We do. So the crossover, because those are bills that we have now, we would
Gotcha,
be
okay.
amending their bills and sending them back. Senator Chittenden.
So I was intrigued as well. So in my mind, we have until like May 13th is like when we're targeting to really wrap up the session. So do you feel like we have all of April as a runway to, what are your deadlines coming up for the remaining months?
Sure. So the deadline that's been shared with me at this point is that leadership on both the Senate and House side hope to adjourn by May 6th. I don't know if that's possible. I think the workload that we have is manageable, but in my mind now, I'm thinking I would like things wrapped up, tidied up, kind of have either most of it off the floor and in committee of conference or on its way to the floor by May 1st, which gives us, a solid month to get this work done. And I don't think, could be wrong. I think what we're going through now is going to be the most time-consuming bit of work. The changes. I think the other things are none of them are really new ideas, new concepts. I think we'll be in pretty good shape with getting everything else done. So,
The more changes we make in anything, the more time the House will need to consider it. So they're gonna, the backup, need another week or two, and then committee of conference or not. So it gets really tight when you start thinking about it.
is that helpful?
It is.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I think so if it got, for the example Senator Lyons just gave, if things get too out of hand, too much back and forth, Senate leadership and the House leadership could just say, forget it, we're adjourning, it's dead, and we're going.
Yeah, the only must-pass bill is the budget.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And so nobody's going to stick around for S-248.
Nope.
No offense. I mean, we're not. It's, I mean, it's.
Geez, Liz.
I know. So that's why we want to get it done and get some of our other work done as well. Once the budget goes,
We're out of here.
we're out of here.
And the House is already done with the budget.
House is done with the budget, so, but it'll take these guys.
Don't forget, they also are gonna have to negotiate conference committees. So it's always that conference committee that takes some time. So first, the Senate has to go through that big bill. This is the way we're doing these. Then send it back.
Yeah, I wasn't invited to the conference committee. I don't know why.
On what?
I wasn't invited to be part of the conference committee, so.
They haven't named it
Well,
yet.
They haven't had
We
any.
haven't had any yet.
Haven't named
Yes,
it yet.
Yeah.
You never know.
I was on one last year and I gave the final away.
Oh, really?
Hmm.
Yeah. To be honest, this committee last year avoided committees of conference. We got to agreements, but in all honesty, it's kind of helpful when there is a committee of conference because it's great for new people in particular to go and learn from that process. and sit down with your House colleagues and go back and forth and try to hammer it out.
Excellent.
So,
Well, I appreciate the clarification.
yeah, no, good questions. Okay, so, really, I would say this language, would move at the earliest sometime late next week, maybe the following week. We're still talking, that would give everybody plenty of time. My concern, is, I don't want to bring something out unless the, both caucuses are comfortable moving in this direction. This is a study, this is a,
It's a
for
start.
as much as possible, get as many people as comfortable with this as possible.
I think you should
It seems
schedule a
that
little
it's
time with
done.
my caucus.
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. I'd be more than happy to. And see where we get. Okay? Okay, the final bit of business, or not the final bit of business, but before we move on to S716, there were questions yesterday of Graham Campbell, and he did get back to us. You'll all recall Mr. Campbell is with during fiscal, and this, there were a number of questions that were raised, and these are his responses for people to have a look at when they have an opportunity. So, okay, moving on to then S7 or H716.
Yeah, two of our witnesses.
If you would let them in, that would be great.
Is that somewhere here in my file, Daphne?
Should be, it's just one page underneath the agenda. So it might not be a big file.
Which one are we going for? 716. Oh, so,
Okay,
yeah,
thank you.
right here.
This is the one we keep getting emailed about.
Yes.
Mhm.
I'm looking for Ms. Simmons really to kick us off. Is she not here?
Not yet. Oh, there she is now.
Great.
There's a delay on YouTube, so I think you're all watching. Yeah, it's eating.
Ms. Simmons, thanks for joining us. There we are. Committee, we have been talking about H17, which one of 716, thank you, which one of the pieces postpones the implementation of some special education language. Ms. Simmons, would you mind refreshing our memories as it relates to what the postponement actually does? And then if you would weigh in, we know you've already been in here a little bit on this. And I think your message to the committee was there was no need to postpone. And we would then have a follow-up question around how do we get, one of the things we've heard from those testifying is teachers and others need to be ready to implement this work and be trained. And we're wondering how the Agency of Education might do that. So that's a little bit of, that's our request of you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Emily Simmons, Agency of Education. Yes, the House passed version of H716 does three things, and two of those changes are about delay in special education roles. So I believe that's the question today. There were many, many changes in Rule Series 2360 made by the State Board, and that work was finished about a year ago. Several of those changes were not strictly required by Act 173, but were consistent with the State Board's authority and the public comment received through rulemaking. A subset of those changes are the topic of the delay contemplated in the bill. They are changes to the rule about measuring adverse effect, which is part of the process of identifying whether a student will be eligible for special education. The other rule has to do with the procedures for identifying one category of special education, which is specific learning disability. So these are rules that are governing the process that an evaluation and planning team undertakes when there is a student being evaluated for special education. And it's really changing just two elements of a very comprehensive process, and not every step or facet of that process is impacted by these rules changes.
Very helpful. So how would the Agency of Education support the work that teachers and schools will need to do around this?
Yes, so the Agency of Education has already pushed out professional development, professional learning on these and the other rules changes contemplated or adopted by the state board last year. We have a team, our Student Support Services Division, who are providing that comprehensive training. A lot of it is available now online for viewing. It has been pushed out to the field, and more of it is still in the final stages of development to be pushed out to the field. We could come back with a presentation of the specifics of that professional development that's been pushed out already and what's immediately forthcoming if the committee is interested. I unfortunately am not your expert on that. I'm aware of the broad strokes, but it's not my team. I think you'd be very happy that it's not the legal team that's primarily responsible for that professional learning.
One question I have, yeah, is there something we can do about that? Is that possible? Or, okay, thanks. How long does the professional training take to get teachers and others up to speed on what needs to be done?
I might frame the professional learning differently, give you a little more context. There are presentations about the rule change itself, and there are presentations about implementation. However, all of this content is pushed out for supervisory union and supervisory district teams to digest and use at a leadership level, a central office level, if you will, to train the individual staff as they see fit in that system. So this is a little different than what some might assume, such as a one session where many educators are enrolled and the teacher is primarily the Agency of Education. What we're doing is sometimes called more of a train the trainer. So I don't know, I don't have the answer to your question, how long it takes, the total number of minutes that are out there. But
What's your turn to them?
Oh, is it?
What happened to us in transportation?
Oh, she's frozen.
Yeah. Senator Chin.
On this point, I'm not sure if you can hear me, Emily, but I talked to my lovely spouse, who's a public school teacher, and I said, would you think the week before this semester, the year begins, is a good time just to put training in this? And she just sort of chuckled. She said, that's always a very, very hectic and busy time. So I think the length of this training is an important question, just to be sensitive to our teachers and how stressed they are after this last 2 years of pandemic. So getting a good feel for how long this training is useful.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good point. And I'm also curious when Ms. Simmons comes back to get a sense of her thoughts around what if people get a sort of do this by requested extension only. You know, some districts might be ready to go, other districts might not be ready to go. And I'm wondering where she thinks the districts are in general. Senator Hooker.
I'm wondering how different this is from the existing process to determine, who is eligible for special ed. So, what is added to this? Who does it involve? And again, going to the length of time that it takes for the training. But how different is this from the system that's in place now?
Ms. Simmons, is that something you can answer?
And I'm so sorry, I'm having some internet problems because of weather, but I heard the question. How different is the changed rule from the former rule? The rules change is in regard to adverse effect is primarily dictating different data, different inputs from the student and their educational experience than the information and data that is relied upon now. So I think you've heard testimony, and I should be considered a layperson when it comes to the evaluation process. I know the text of the rule, but not the implementation. But the former adverse effect rule relied on very objective data measurements, test scores, for instance, numbers. The new rule is more characterized as more holistic and more subjective. Sometimes that word has a negative connotation. In this context, educators have described it as looking more at the whole child than a cold set of numbers. So the training that has to be done, as I understand it, to make this shift is talking about how to collect the new, more comprehensive information, data points, and how to evaluate it, how to norm that use of information.
Yeah, Ms. Simmons, we've heard testimony from folks, and I don't know if you've heard it or read it, that they're concerned about a harm that would be caused if we didn't delay. And I didn't know if we did delay. So I want to know if the agency has an opinion, or if you are worried about that, if we did delay, what kind of harm would be caused. But no, I guess my question really is from the people from the other side. The people that want to delay it, they said that if we put it in place on July 1st, that it will be kind of chaotic, that we'll have inconsistencies between different districts because of their abilities. They might have already been doing it, or they have ability to do the training better than other schools. So my question is, does AOE share these concerns, or do you feel that you have the capability and the trainers and the support mechanisms to bring the schools so that by the time school starts, they can do these evaluations in a way that won't cause harm to their children? Does that make sense? Did I get there in the end? Okay.
Yeah.
It makes sense to me. The harm, they're both advocates for and against delay see risks in not taking their preferred approach. So I think the advocates for delay primarily view the risks as unreadiness, uneven implementation, and third, potential findings against the district as a result of its unreadiness. I can take that third one off the table a little bit. The Agency of Education's monitoring team is preparing to take and this is not an announcement of this policy, this is a plan policy that we're evaluating right now, just a continuous improvement approach to these rules changes, a supportive approach to these rule changes rather than making findings against taking punitive action against districts in the first year because of their unreadiness. So I think, to put it more simply than the way I just said, we're going to be very understanding from a monitoring point of view around these rules and the fact that folks got ready very quickly for this rule change. We do always have concerns at the agency about uneven implementation. We know it's just a reality that some of our districts have more ability to pivot quickly than others, and it's going to take longer for change to be implemented in some of our districts just because of their circumstances. So the agency is going to have a lot of work to do to support all districts. We are in favor of going ahead with the rule change without delay because we feel ready to provide that support and believe we've already begun to provide that support, and we'll be there for the field in time for this change to take place.
Senator Chipman. Senator Percy, did you finish?
No,
Okay.
Emily, what you just said really validates where my mind is currently going on this. I must say, I asked last week what the caution would be if we just allowed schools to go that are feeling ready for this year, but without penalty, and making it clear that they can, if they're not feeling ready and they need another year, to allow for other school districts to take the delay. I'm of the opinion that that's the best way forward to enable each school district to choose how ready they are. The only counter argument I heard was that that would be inequitable across districts. To that point, I already see inequities in the entrance age for kindergartens and how we resource our schools that we're trying to address in other ways. What would be your counter arguments against just allowing and adjusting this language to make clear that districts that don't feel ready for this year can take a whole nother year, while at the same time allowing the schools ready to enact it this July 1st?
I would really caution against that formal institution, formally giving different dates for different districts, because we're talking about a federal educational entitlement that has enforcement in federal law. So a parent who has a complaint has a federal dispute resolution process of administrative complaints or due process complaints. And we at the state can't do anything about disallowing that remedy. So what you would have is legal rights in one district that are different than the other district. A parent might have a claim against the state in a district that did not implement if their child experienced harm as a result of the delay in their district, because that could be seen as legally unequal treatment as a matter of state policy.
Senator Shipman.
So to follow up on that, if we allowed the language that came from the House over formally delaying a year, what would be the problem with a school district that chose to adopt a year early? Would you say if we let this language go through and we let them delay for a year and a school district says, no, we're ready this year, would you caution them against doing so?
They would be allowing more, very, very generally, they'd be permitting more special education than is legally required. So it is less likely that a parent would have an actionable complaint against them just because of the posture of how that change would take place. It still would be worth analyzing with their district council whether it's prudent to go ahead with that change out in front of the formal policy change as a matter of state law.
Didn't we hear testimony that at least one school is already doing this? And so they're already going ahead and they're using this new form of doing the adverse impact test. At least that's what my understanding is.
What's to stop them from doing so?
Right.
And they're not.
So if we leave the delay, if I may.
No, please, yeah.
So if we leave the delay in place, acknowledging that some schools have already adopted these rules, let's delay it a year, but then if school districts adopt it early, what's the matter with that? I'm not seeing a downside to that.
Would you repeat that question?
So if we accepted the House proposal
Yeah,
to delay for a year.
yeah.
Where is the downside with schools that feel ready and choose to adopt this coming summer?
Senator Bursko.
Well, I don't think there's a downside for allowing the schools to go ahead and do it, but there's a downside for the students in those schools that delay a year. Because they won't get the services that they need if the different way of measuring the child's needs, that year they'll lose one more year of getting that additional service. So that would be the reason that I would want to be cautious. And I don't know how many schools we're talking. So if it was 80% would go forward and 20% didn't, that would be different than if it's 2 schools go forward and 400 delay a year, because then that's a lot more students. I mean, that's the main argument that I hear from those that don't want to delay, is that there's students that they feel would be harmed because they won't get the educational services that they need, because they'll fail the adverse test. So the school will say, the student didn't meet the adverse impact, and so therefore we're not going to give that student the services. But just next year, they're going to get the services under the more holistic approach.
Yeah.
I mean, that's how I see the two sides.
Senator Hooker, do you want to add something?
I'm trying to get my thoughts around, how is this kind of rolled out in a school and how long it takes to implement this? And are there time restrictions on, like when kids have to be tested, when they're being monitored? I mean, I still don't understand really what it entails. I'm sympathetic to not wanting to put more on teachers and staff because of the pandemic and all, but what does it actually entail? And if we put it into motion as it was intended, then, does that mean that, people have to kind of rush to get this accomplished, I guess is the question.
Ms. Simmons, did you want to add anything based on what you've heard?
Listening to that comment, I'm very sympathetic to the committee not having full visibility into what's being offered to districts and where that puts them. I would offer that I think the committee would really benefit from testimony by Jackie Kelleher, the State Director of Special Education, who's responsible for the professional development that's going out and who is a special educator. She could answer your questions more detailed. I'm sorry, I really should have brought her today. I feel that there's a lot she could bring to this conversation.
Yeah, have her on the schedule for sometime this week. Jackie Kelleher?
Not scheduled yet, but we.
Okay, let's have her in tomorrow. And she'll give us an idea of how people are trained, the length of time, all that sort of thing. That would be very helpful. Okay. Back to what you were saying regarding federal disputes. Are you saying that if we don't delay in something, and for whatever reason, a school or a teacher is not trained properly, are we putting the school in some kind of jeopardy with regard to a penalty from the federal government?
The school is in jeopardy of having a complaint against it in that hypothetical. It's the kinds of actions that come out when there is an administrative complaint in favor of the parent or a due process complaint in favor of the parent go to getting services to the student. So it's not an enforcement action by the federal government per se. It's a request for relief from the parent that would be granted by it's actually the Agency of Education that decides administrative complaints and independent hearing officers in Vermont who decide due process complaints. And either neutral party can order reevaluation of the student, particular actions of the school district, remedies, for the student's education.
And then I think my final question is, do you have a sense of how many districts are ready to go percentage-wise with this? How many are not? Or is this all new training that would happen?
With regard to the adverse effect rule, there's more new there. This is different than the practices that would have existed in any school district prior to the new rule. With regard to the identification of specific learning disability, there's less new there. Some districts were already voluntarily using an approach that is still permitted by the rule. Some districts were using an approach that is now disallowed by the rule. So that's the change there. I believe the data question is a good one for Jackie Kelleher. I'm not sure how the data collection by the agency is actually framed, but we do have some, so I think it's survey type information about district readiness.
Any other questions for Ms. Simmons before we move on to other witnesses? So we'll look forward to hearing, Daphne will schedule the individual you mentioned that can give us a sense of the training tomorrow. And in the meantime, we'll continue right now hearing from mostly parents and special education advocates on where they stand as it relates to the delay. And let's start, if we may, we don't have anything, thank you, with Ms. Crenshaw.
Hi, can you hear me and see me okay?
Yes, welcome. Welcome back.
Thank you. Thank you for hearing my testimony today. I am a person with a disability. I have ADD, so unfortunately I have to read my testimony or else my brain won't process is what I'm trying to say. But my name is Jamie Crenshaw. I'm a parent member of the Vermont Special Education Advisory Panel. I'm also a graduate of the Vermont Leadership Series. I am a mother of 2 sons, ages 18 and 16, both of which have been diagnosed with dyslexia and dysgraphia. For today's testimony, I will be speaking as a parent and not as a representative of any organization. As stated in my March 18th written testimony, I do not support the delay in implementing Rule 2362 or Rule 2362.2.5. In my opinion, delaying the changes would mean that Vermont is choosing to willfully be in defiance of the federal IDEA law because we are denying students with disabilities the right of early identification and evaluation as afforded under IDEA. Section 2 of Bill H-716 is asking this committee to answer the question of whether our educators and staff have time to adequately prepare for delivery of special education services. In all honesty, I don't understand why this question is being asked. When the Vermont Board of Education approved the rule changes, they determined these changes were necessary. Through public comment, the Board of Education heard evidence that the language in the current Vermont Rule 2362 was overly rigid and caused students to be found ineligible for special education services on a technical or formulaic basis, rather than the well-informed judgment of qualified special educators. This means that Vermont students with disabilities were being denied a free and appropriate education, an entitlement protected under the Individuals with Disabilities Act. It shouldn't matter that the changes came from public comment. It doesn't make it any less important. Sorry, turning my page. 16 VSA 1657 states that our local education agencies need to ensure that students are furnished educational services in accordance with any state or federal entitlements. Early identification, evaluations, and special education and related services for students with disabilities are entitlements protected under IDEA. IDEA 300.101C states that each state must ensure that a free, appropriate public education is available to any individual child with a disability who needs special education related services, even though the child has not failed or been retained or in a course or grade and is advancing from grade to grade. Significantly below grade norms means the 15th percentile or below. This is waiting for failure before supports are provided. Public comments also identified that the language in Vermont's current Rule 2362 and 2362.2.5 also denied FAPE for students in the categories of disability, deafblindness, and specific learning disabilities. Neither of these categories require an adverse effect on educational performance. The removal of adverse effect is especially important when it comes to fulfilling Vermont's goal set in 16 VSA 2903, preventing early school reading failure, reading intervention. The statute states, children who fail to read by the end of first grade will likely fall further behind in school. The personal and economic costs of reading failure are enormous, both while the student remains in school and long afterwards. The State Board of Education, in collaboration with the Agency of Human Services, Higher Education, literacy organizations, and others, shall develop a plan for establishing a comprehensive system of services for early education in the first 3 grades to ensure that all students learn to read by the end of 3rd grade. A comprehensive system of services includes early identification, evaluations, and special education and related services for students with specific learning disabilities who, by reason of, under IDEA section 300.8, require special education and related services. IDEA section 300.8 requires that a child meet 2-pronged tests to be considered a child with a disability. The child must have one of the specified 13 disabilities, and they must, because of their impairment, need special education related services. How does the evaluation and planning team answer these 2 questions? And I'm hoping this will provide some of that, some of the questions, answers to the questions that you had asked. They do it through the special education process. Of note, this is the process that many people have stated would require a significant practice change for any special educators. There are 7 steps in the process, and from my understanding, only 1 step is impacted by the rule changes. The first step is referral or child find, and I'm not going to go through what each one means. I'm only going to explain the one that's being impacted. So the first one is referral or child find. Second one is review of existing information and data to determine if an evaluation is warranted. The third is consent for an evaluation. The fourth is evaluation data assessments and other information. This one is the most crucial when it comes to evaluating a child, because this is where they collect all of the data on the and information about the child. It comes from the general education teachers, it comes from special education teachers, anybody that has knowledge of that child has to be part of this data accumulation. The comprehensive evaluation must provide information relevant to making decisions about how to educate the student so that they can access, engage, and make meaningful progress towards meeting age and grade level standards. The fifth step is evaluation findings, which is interpreting the data. Again, it's already in current law, nothing changes there. What is changing is step 6, and that's the eligibility decisions. This is when the team determines eligibility. This is the step that is most impacted by the rule changes, but I believe it is positively impacted. The rule changes ease the restrictions on eligibility. The team may now make decisions relying on the evaluation data that's been collected and their expertise and knowledge. The decision around a child's eligibility is not always going to be the same from school to school, and it shouldn't be. Each decision must be made by the team on a case-by-case basis, depending on the unique individual needs of a particular child, not based only on discrepancies in age or grade performance in academic subject areas. The last step is the evaluation report. And again, that's not impacted by the current, by the rule changes. The special education process, these 7 steps will not and does not change regardless of which 3 identification methods is utilized. The only step that is being impacted by the rule change is step 6, the eligibility decision, which, as others have stated, simplifies the process so that decisions made by the team are decisions that rely on the combined expertise and knowledge of each participant before the student fails. Therefore, I do not see how the changes in the rules would require a significant practice change for our special educators. The rule changes align with the intent of Act 173. The 4 main goals of Act 173, as they relate to services provided to all students who require additional supports, are effectiveness of services, availability of services, equity of services, and supervisory union compliance with IDEA and state law. This is what Secretary Dan French has to use to measure whether Vermont is effective in implementing Act 173. He has to use those 4 goals. The Vermont Board of Education voted to approve rule changes so that Vermont would align with existing federal IDEA laws, and more importantly, to ensure a free and appropriate education to all its students, including students with disabilities, before failure sets in. They also approved the rule changes so that Vermont could ensure the goals of Act 173 are implemented effectively. Bill H716 has passed over to your committee. The bill suspends the implementation of Rules 2362 and 2362.25 until July 1st, 2023. The sole intent of the delay is to allow educators and staff time to adequately prepare for the delivery of special education services. To delay the implementation of the rules is not only a violation of student rights to equal education access, but is, in my opinion, unnecessary. The special education process has existed in the federal IDEA law since it was last reauthorized in 2004. Determining specific learning disability eligibility using a model based on whether the student responds to scientific research-based interventions has also existed in the state of Vermont special education rules since it was adopted in June 13th, 2013. The multi-tiered system of support was implemented in 2014. This means that Vermont educators and staff should already be fully trained and knowledgeable in determining disability eligibility. This includes using the response to intervention method. There should be no ambiguity or any significant professional development when implementing the new rule change. In closing, I ask that this committee consider removing Section 2 from H716. It is critical that Vermont special education regulations align with federal IDEA and that the existing provision of a free and appropriate education for children with disabilities be retained. Thank you for your time. Any questions?
Thank you for your testimony. And you have submitted your testimony?
I didn't. I kind of just jotted down what I wanted to say this morning, but
Sure.
I can make it more formal and send it in if you'd like.
That would be terrific. That would be a big help if you would send it to Daphne. Thank you.
Sure. Can I add
Questions?
one thing?
Yes,
Can I
please,
add
go
one
ahead.
other thing? I just want to say that when it comes down to determining eligibility, the Agency of Education back in 2016 created an adverse effect chart. This chart, and I can send it to you. This chart has the measures that educators must use when determining. It has different examples of tests that they can use. And then it has a criteria for comparison. The only thing that is changing within the entire process is the criteria that people are using to determine eligibility. Everything else is exactly the same. So I don't understand how this is such a big process within our schools.
Okay, Senator Persick.
A quick question. You had mentioned a few disabilities that don't need to have the adverse impact designation. Can you?
Yes.
I can't remember who said it. Which ones were those again?
It's specific learning disability and deaf blindness. If you look, and this is in my first testimony that I sent on March 18th, if you look at the definitions of those disability categories, there is not an adverse effect. Every other disability category says within their definition that they have to have adverse effect on their educational performance. These two disability types do not have that written in there. Therefore, when it comes to determining eligibility, they have to see, does this child fall under this disability category as defined by 300.8? And if they do, they use that information they drew from all of the different assessments and they say, do they need special education services? And it's important to note that the team should be looking at whether or not that child could make up the deficit, reduce the gap that's been created between he and his peers, they and their peers, within the special education classroom. Because that is the big question is, do they need additional supports in order to reduce that gap? And if it can't be done within the general education classroom, then it has to be required by special education if they fall under, a child with a disability and they need special education. I hope that makes sense.
No, that's helpful. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Feel free, Ms. Crenshaw, to stay on. We're going to move to Ms. Ballard. We do have, we're hoping to hear from everyone in the next 15 minutes. So if one way to think about it is, do you have new information to share as it relates to this issue?
Thank you so much. And I apologize, my camera's off. My internet is not working very well.
It's
so
no
my
problem
audio
at all.
Great. I'm going to read really quickly. I wrote something so that I could stick to the timeline and hopefully be very quick. So good afternoon, and thank you to Chairman Campion and the rest of the committee for taking the time to hear from myself, Jamie, and Sandra. In an effort to be concise and not repetitive, I'm going to try and keep my testimony brief, but I want to echo that I agree with the points Jamie and Sandra will or have made today. And I am here today to strongly advocate against delaying the rule change related to specific learning disabilities especially. I'm a parent of 3 children, 2 of whom are living with disabilities, including learning disabilities. As a parent, I know firsthand this rule change would have changed the trajectory of my own son and stop the increasing stress and isolation he faced due to the lack of appropriate intervention and identification of his learning disabilities. As an advocate, I support families in many different buildings and districts across Vermont, and I have seen multiple children just in the last couple of months be denied eligibility due to not having enough measures to show a severe discrepancy. These children are often viewed as a behavior problem, and while their disruptions clearly come from the frustrational level work and their learning disabilities, their behavior is what they're given support for. By treating behavior as the only lens we view these children struggling with, we set them up for stigmas and stress that impact their ability to access their education, as well as their overall sense of self. I briefly testified to the House Education Committee on this bill before they passed the bill out of committee, and I'd like to briefly share my thoughts again with all of you. It makes me sad and disappointed to hear such a focus on the stress and preparation of districts and educators and not hear more intentional focus on our children living and struggling with potentially unidentified disabilities. Even if I thought the delay was appropriate, it would be really helpful to feel like the focus on this shift is not just based on the comfort and needs of the professionals. Our children and students with disabilities must be at the forefront of our discussion and should not be left unspoken about. As a member of various groups and councils, I know firsthand some of the amazing work being done over the last year to help prepare for this by Jackie Kelleher and her team at the AOE. They are available and able to provide the technical support to those in need of it before July, and I hope this committee has, or obviously you just said you would, be hearing from her and her team directly on how they have and can support districts and educators without delaying this change. The risk of over-identifying should not and cannot be greater than the potential to help those with real needs sooner. If we are providing comprehensive and quality evaluations and interventions, this change shouldn't feel so overwhelming to those who already have the knowledge and the ability to make this shift. And for those who need the support, the AOE is prepared and ready to support them with the technical assistance, and we should give them the opportunity to lead this work on the current timeline. Someone recently told myself and a fellow advocate that we are privileged by our level of knowledge and the access we have to those in the system and the leadership positions. Now, full disclosure, as someone living with a disability myself, with 2 sons living with disabilities and a family that struggles financially, I've never seen myself as privileged in that way before. But they weren't totally wrong. I do spend a lot of time in many meetings for students across the state. And what that has taught me is there are many children who are not being identified, who are struggling with other identified needs that are being ignored by the current structure. And I wish that the families I work with had a stronger voice in this room. But even getting myself a voice today was challenging. Please do not think that this is a minor issue. It really isn't, and it shouldn't be delayed specifically for one group to the preparation from the field. For those that may remember, about 2 years ago, right around this time before COVID, I was testifying about the rule changes in dyslexia, and I was very emotional because I had just learned through an independent evaluation my son had profound learning disabilities that hadn't been appropriately identified or supported from kindergarten until 7th grade. Had there been less reliance on a discrepancy model, it would have been fully identified, and his behaviors in isolation, as I mentioned, would have been much less. Since that time, my son has made huge gains in reading, math, and writing, and that is due to the collaborative path this team has taken on focusing on strengths and weaknesses rather than just the documentation collected during the assessment and the rigid requirements for eligibility. I share that because I've seen firsthand that we do have many districts and educators who are ready for this change if they aren't the voices you hear in this room, even if they aren't the voices you hear in this room. And we have a team at the AOE who is ready and able to provide technical support, and parents who are ready to support their families using the flexibility this change will allow, not only to help identify their children with learning disabilities, but to begin to provide the interventions and supports that will ultimately be needed, and to do so before the costs and intensity escalate as the child gets older. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Feller. Any questions at this point? Ms. Chittenden and Ms. Ballard, please feel free to stay on as we continue to hear. We're going to hear from Ms. Chittenden, and then we're going to hear from one more witness and have some committee discussion about this. Ms. Chittenden.
I'm also having some connectivity issues. For the record, my name is Sandra Chittenden. I just want to say thank you, Chair Champion, and all of the Senate Ed Committee members for taking all of the testimony that you have thus far. I think Katie and Jamie pretty much said everything I was going to say. And the only thing that I would add, that as a special ed advocate, I'm seeing many children that are being denied IEPs because of this discrepancy model. And it's a huge issue for their self-esteem, their self-worth, their self-confidence. It causes behavioral problems within the school environment, and at home, socially. Kids are really struggling. We're coming out of a pandemic. I know that, teachers have had a lot on their plates, but Vermont is essentially not in compliance with the IDEA SLD requirements. There are some districts that are already doing this model, and some districts who plan on doing this July 1st, 2022. My own daughter, when she was in kindergarten, didn't qualify for an IEP, although she had all the characteristics of dyslexia and dyscalculia. And once she got to 3rd grade, she did qualify, but she only qualified for math because of the discrepancy model. And she was able to receive related services for the reading, but she still didn't qualify under SLD for reading, although she had dyslexia. And she didn't receive appropriate intervention until 4th grade. And luckily her dyslexia was mild, but her dyscalculia is not, and she still hasn't closed those gaps with her basic math computation. And it takes 4 times the amount of money to remediate these children when they're not remediated early as in, kindergarten, first and second grade. So I would really like the committee to really think about the effect that it's going to have on the children in delaying it another year, given where we are and how far these kids, are already behind. So thank you for allowing me to give testimony this afternoon.
Thank you for taking the time to provide us with the testimony. Any questions or comments at this point from Ms. Chittenden? Ms. Chittenden, again, feel free to stay right on as we continue our conversation. Ms. Price, thanks for joining us from the Vermont Family Network. I don't think we've had you in committee yet this year, so welcome. Eager to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you then for inviting the Vermont Family Network to testify today on H 716. VFN is the federally designated Parent Training and Information PTI Center in Vermont. PTIs are required by the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and we exist in every state. At VFN, we have been supporting families of children with disabilities for more than 30 years. Our family support program operates a helpline where we respond to families who call us when they have concerns and questions about their child from early learning through transition to adulthood. Special education eligibility and evaluation has been the primary reason for many of our helpline calls. I have submitted written testimony to this committee a couple of weeks ago, and I will not duplicate that information today. But I will merely repeat that VFN opposes any implementation delay of the 2360 rules regarding adverse effect and specific learning disabilities. I hope to proffer some additional insight today. In April 2015, the Agency of Education convened a stakeholder group to inform and review a guidance document that will provide greater consistency across the state and provide interpretations from the AOE for areas not explicitly identified and generally misapplied within the current adverse effect rule. This was an acknowledgement that schools had struggled with interpreting and applying adverse effect for many years. In addition, when IDEA was reauthorized at the federal level in 2004, there was clarification that educational performance consists of both academic and functional performance. But the Vermont special education rules only listed academic skill areas when considering eligibility for special education. When the state rules implementing the 2004 changes were being promulgated 18 years ago, advocates and families asked to address the adverse effect criterion. We were told there was insufficient time to address this and that there would be opportunity to do so at a later date. Nothing happened. The Vermont rules were revised again in 2009 and in 2012. That's 10 years ago. Again, we asked to address concerns about the adverse effect criterion. Again, we were told there was insufficient time and were promised an opportunity to address adverse effect after that round of rule revisions were completed, and nothing happened. Without that needed rule change, the stakeholder group of 2015, of which VFN was a member, worked into 2016 to provide guidance and training so that special education teams would consider the effects of functional deficits on academic skills when determining special education eligibility. This, in effect, made determination of special education eligibility even more convoluted. Removing the current operational definition of adverse effect has the potential to greatly simplify the eligibility process for educators. It will bring Vermont into conformance with the federal definition of educational performance, which, remember, came from the 2004 IDEA reauthorization. This will also shift the focus onto what we call the third gate of special education eligibility, which is to assess the child's need for services. This will help children. So some situations we know of from families who have called us, whose children were not considered eligible for special education services under the current definition of adverse effect. Teachers at the school tell me my child is too bright to qualify for special education. She has no friends. I see her not participating appropriately or even at all during circle times. Sometimes she sits outside the group, paying attention to a completely unrelated object. Even in group projects, the other children ignore her suggestions. She's often confused by the activity going on in the classroom and doesn't understand what to do. Another example, I get called 2 to 3 times a week to pick my child up from school for all sorts of behavior issues. Sometimes he defies the teacher, or he disrupts the class by being loud. He distracts other students. I'm starting to think his teacher hates him and uses the first opportunity to send him home. I can't keep my job if I have to leave so often to bring him home. Yet when I ask the school for help, they say he is too bright to qualify for special education. We often hear from parents that they are discouraged from requesting a special education evaluation because kids are too smart. Without social skills instruction or behavior plans, children's communication skills and behavior can continue to deteriorate until they fail their academic classes through their inability to access their education, thereby finally qualifying for special education. But we don't want our kids to have to fail over and over again before receiving help. Vermont has one of the highest rates of students who qualify for special education in the emotional disturbance disability category. One of the possible reasons for this is when an underlying learning disability is not diagnosed and remediated, the child exhibits behavioral challenges through embarrassment and frustration. They then qualify for special education. But a behavior plan is not a substitute for appropriate instruction. Early identification through implementation of the new rules will get our students the help they need in a timelier fashion. Informal refusals to evaluate are another barrier many families face. A school may report that they have processed all the parents' requests for special education evaluations in a timely fashion, resulting in almost all the children qualifying and receiving special education services. What you have heard repeatedly are the parents who are told orally that their children will not qualify and that they should not bother to request an evaluation. If a parent does not submit a request for a special evaluation in writing to the appropriate school administrator, there is no record of one being requested. Under the new rules regarding specific learning disabilities, districts will no longer use the discrepancy model for eligibility, but instead determine whether the student responds to scientific research-based intervention. Response to intervention, RTI, and multi-tiered systems of support, MTSS, have been part of the education landscape long before the pandemic. I went through my records and I saw that in 2009, VFN, in partnership with the Agency of Education, then the Department of Education, developed a booklet entitled Response to Intervention, a Guide for Parents. I do have a link to that in my written testimony that I have submitted. This was to help parents understanding of RTI so they could work in partnership with schools. This booklet was done 13 years ago. Children with disabilities have been disproportionately affected by the pandemic. More than ever, our children need earlier identification and intervention. They have already suffered through 2 years of disrupted schooling. Further delay of the new rules will penalize them further. Please make the right decision and prioritize the needs of Vermont's most vulnerable children. Please implement the 2360 rules in their original timeframe. So thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Price. Any questions or comments for Ms. Price at this point? Thank you all for joining us. We very much appreciate it. This is very helpful, and we hope you'll follow our work as we continue to make work on this decision. Committee, this is certainly a decision point. I think when I look back to who we heard from that really wants to delay, I believe it was the Vermont Principal Association, Superintendents Association. Is that accurate?
They supported the delay, but it seemed like they were supporting others that were asking for the delay more than
Who
having
was
their
really
own.
pushing for this early on? I know it's just escaping my mind. Teachers, educators.
I thought we heard from 2 special educators that were.
Yeah, 2 special educators and the school psychologists association sent us that letter.
That's right. Yes, Senator Shinn.
So I just would really like to know how many schools approximately feel ready for this versus don't, and also how much time the training's gonna involve over the summer.
Well, we'll have the training folks come in tomorrow for about 15 minutes, I would say. And that should hopefully give us a sense of what this actually looks like. Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined not to really push this out, but we'll continue to hear from folks.
I'm not in favor of the delay.
Yeah, that's where I am right now.
It's gonna
at-
affect so many
at
students,
this
so many
moment.
kids.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to remember when we acted on the rules. I think it was in the fall. And I think one of the problems is that this has been a very difficult time for everyone. So seeing something new and different and having to restructure the way you do things is probably overwhelming. So, but I agree that maybe the summer will be a time for people to catch up a little bit.
And let's see what the training looks like.
Yeah.
And we'll do that tomorrow.
Yeah.
The other decision point that we're going to be working a little bit on tomorrow is PCBs, and just that's another thing that the House has sent us that is asking for a 2-year delay, and we need to start to point whether or not.
The House
That's
includes
to
it?
get
2 years?
things.
Oh, I'm sorry. They are sending us something that will have a 2-year delay. I
They
believe
want
their
it
That's to
intention.
get
2-year
the
delay.
testing done.
They want, it was, colleagues will recall, we had Peter Walk and others in asking for it. Their intention is to send it over on our miscellaneous education bill. So we could either, when we get it back, strip it out if we don't agree, or reconfirm it in our document when we send their miscellaneous ed. Different ways to do it. So it's another decision point. Anything else, Senator Lyons, before we adjourn?
So I'm looking at Graham's memo, answering questions, and I don't see anything in here that would say that we can't put money aside for a school support fund.
Fine, yeah.
And so if we're saying delay, let's not delay until we know if we can't do something like that.
Right. Yeah, I agree. We're also continuing a little bit later this week on the military, 3 military bills that we have. And that, I would say, will probably be our first vote sometime next week, because there's no real reason to delay all of that. We go offline, I think we're done.
Amy has some waiting.
No, she went to our house. Thank you, though.